Hello, my name is Braden Baker, and this is my senior project. My senior project is a Moodle log analysis, and this is a solo project, so I am the project lead. The client for this project was Sarah Faulkner, who is the instructional designer at St. Martin's University. And so the goal of this project was that St. Martin's staff wants to improve the effectiveness of their learning management system, Moodle. And Moodle is what we currently use at St. Martin's to basically conduct classes. It's where students will get lecture information from their teachers, or they'll post old lectures they can go back and look, and they'll also turn in assignments, discuss with their other classmates using forms, and some other features as well. And so this is a very important part of our education at St. Martin's and how we receive it. So this is something that St. Martin's staff wants to improve any way they can. And so one way they decided to improve this will be to use some test plugins for Moodle courses during the spring semester that's currently ongoing. And so what a Moodle plugin is basically just like an added feature or function that you can add to Moodle that just adds some sort of extra functionality or feature that doesn't come with the base version of Moodle that we currently use. And so like some examples of what a plugin could be are something that adds like more exam question types or layouts, or something that allows Moodle to integrate better with some other system like Zoom or Perusal, and or something that just adds extra administrative options for instructors. And on the picture on the right there, you can see an example of a plugin that is used for a checklist. There's basically just something that allows the instructors to create a little checklist of all the work students have to do, and then they can use that to keep track of everything. That's just a good example of what we're trying to do, just a little something that can make Moodle easier to use for both students and instructors. And so for the purpose, for me, is to provide analysis to my project client, and that can help the client in improving the instructional ability of Moodle for both students and instructors. And so my role in achieving that purpose will be to analyze the Moodle logs and track activity in students both in test classes that are having the new plugins being tested, and also in normal classes as well. And so in test classes, I'll be looking at the logs, and the focus will be on analyzing how much students are using the new plugins, because what my client wants to see is basically just, are students using the plugins? Is this kind of like a waste of time to implement if students aren't actually using it? And so I'll be looking at questions like, how often did a student interact with the plugin? When did they use the plugins? Or did the plugins usage increase or decrease during the semester? And in normal classes, I'll be looking more focused on just some key questions that my client wanted to know about how students are interacting with Moodle, to help them kind of understand how students are using Moodle and how they can best design classes to meet how they're using it. And so I'll be looking at questions like, how long does it take for a student to view assignment feedback? When are students watching recorded lectures? Or which Moodle resources are students interacting with the most or the least? And so to answer these questions, I will be using the R programming language to capture, clean, aggregate, and visualize the data contained in Moodle logs. The reason I used R over some other visualization tools like Tableau or Power BI or even SSRS is that just due to the nature of the data and how it's captured is in log format. And so it's very kind of bare bones how it is. There's not a lot there besides the event and name. And so I had to use R because it has better features in transforming data, both to create some new data using what we have and do all sorts of calculations that would have been much harder to do on a tool like Tableau, Power BI, or SSRS that focuses only on data visualization. R has visualization and data transformation. So that is why I used it for this project. And so the findings of this analysis will be used to help advise instructors on how to structure their class to better meet the students, and also in helping my client decide which plugins that they would like to add for future courses, because this analysis will aid them in deciding which plugins that should be used forever, because they're just testing in these spring classes, and the ones that are used a lot will kind of be implemented in every class to help improve Moodle. And so for the role and responsibility, this is a solo project, so I will be responsible for all communication with the project client, all communication with St. Martin's Information Technology staff, writing the code to gather and clean the Moodle log data, along with writing the code to create visualizations and analysis of the Moodle log data, and also the presentation of the visualizations and analysis. And then so some of the technical and qualitative restraints for this project are that the data must be anonymized. And so this kind of restrains me in two ways. First of all, when gathering the data, someone had to access the data before I did and delete all of the student name and columns to make sure that there wasn't any way that they could be identified. And then, so that just was kind of one little thing that needed to be worked around before I could work with the data. And then also the fact that it's anonymized means that I had less data to work with, because since it was anonymized, I couldn't see like a student's grade they received in the course, or maybe the other classes they're taking to kind of gauge their workload and better understand the student. And so that was one area that I could have used more data if it was anonymized, but that's just how it is. And then the next restraint was that the spring semester was ongoing during this project and still is. And so that meant that I didn't really get a good idea of how the plugins would be used until, halfway through the spring semester, close to when this project was due. And so I ended up doing most of this project with about 3/4 or so of the semester's worth of data in the spring semester, just because it was ongoing and I couldn't research any of the plugins until they had been used by students and enough logs had been generated to really look at them. So that was one thing. And then one of the third restraints and one of the bigger ones was that the Moodle logs aren't stored by St. Martin's IT. They're actually stored by a third-party vendor we use called eThink, and they host all of our Moodle courses for us on their servers. And so while we can gather data for current classes and download them through Moodle, if we wanted to access older classes, we had to work through them. So that was one restraint that just kind of made it a little bit harder to gather the data, but luckily they had good customer support and we were able to get in contact with them. And then the final technical restraint was that only data captured by the logs can be analyzed. And this kind of goes with the first restraint as well, as that the logs for Moodle didn't capture every bit of data that you would have liked. So this made it a little bit harder to fully understand some of the trends that I found in Moodle. Like just for example, the logs don't capture the due date for an assignment. And so that was something I kind of had to infer by when it was added and when students started turning in assignments. And so that was just one thing I kind of had to work around and gave me less data to work with. And then so here are some of the risks I identified back when we originally started in December. And so the first risk was that there's the researchable level of the plugins. And so my client and her team gave a list of 10 plugins to St. Martin's ITS. And of those 10 plugins, not all of them were able to be implemented by our ITS department just due to compatibility issues or other reasons. And then of the ones that did get implemented, not every plugin was captured by the logs, so it was kind of unanalyzable. Not all of them were. And so the result of this risk kind of meant that the focus of this project shifted away from plugin analysis being the main topic to kind of being a split between plugin analysis and then just kind of general Moodle analysis on some fall classes as well and the spring classes, and just seeing how students use Moodle normally. And that led to me answering some questions that my client posed that she wanted to know about in Moodle. So it shifted from all plugins to plugins and general trends as well, was the result of that risk. The second risk of this project was that there'd be limited data to draw decisive conclusions. And this is mainly because, there's only been a semester of online hybrid classes completed, and that was the fall semester. And then we have a 3/4 of a semester in the spring semester to add on. And so there's not a lot of base data to use. And furthermore, there would be only a few test classes that are using the plugins. And so this ended up being, I resulted in I had 8 classes that were in the test group, and not every class in the 8 used every single plugin. And so some classes I'd only have a class or two to gauge a plugin on. And so this resulted in that there was some class structure that skewed the data a little bit. So it does make it a little bit harder to read, but luckily, just because the skew is there is something you have to work around. But that was a problem that came up just because there was so few data. One class that did something all at like one time of the day would kind of skew how the activity looked. So that was something that had to be worked around. And then the final risk was that the project scalability will be a challenge. And even though all the logs are the same, so any code that I wrote for a log from this class will be just the same for logs for a class maybe next year or even 2 years later. So that's all reusable. But Currently, we don't receive data continually from eThink about the logs from our Moodle courses. And so if we were to receive that regularly and set up kind of a self-updating dashboard or something with this data, we would have had to change the relationship we have with eThink to get that data sent to us regularly. And that is something that just didn't work out, wasn't something that ITS or my client was super interested in doing. And so for now, we can just get data manually from current classes, but we can't get anything from the past just due to that not changing. So at the moment, this is be kind of just a one report and done. It's not going to be a self updating dashboard as a result of this just one final report. And then so for the schedule of this project, most of September and October was spent communicating with the information technology staff and also planning with the project client of how we were going to do the project. And then most of November was when I got a sample of logs from one class and I started building kind of the framework for how to clean the data and get an idea of what analysis was capable of doing. And then December and January was when the kind of the talks of gathering data increased a lot. So I worked with my client, ITS, and eThink on gathering data and a lot of back and forth communications and kind of getting everything set up for where I'd be able to receive the data from fall classes as well as the spring test classes. And then in February, I finally received access to some classes from the fall. And so I was able to begin analyzing the fall classes. And in those ones, like I was saying before, I just took a look at kind of general student trends and answered some questions that were requested by my client to answer in some key areas, like how students turned in assignments or how many days it took students to turn in assignments and things like that. And then in March, I was able to receive access to the spring logs from the test classes that were using the plugins. And so then I was finally able to start analyzing how the plugins were used, as well as continue analyzing the fall classes for general student activity and start putting together a presentation for those. And then so that brings us to April where we are now. And now I'm just finalizing the code, the presentation, and the documentation for the results of the analysis for the fall and spring classes. And so for the budget of this project, the actual budget was for free. There was no money spent in making this project happen. And this is because we only use logs that were gathered by Moodle automatically. There was no extra service or anything that we had to pay for to get these logs. It was just happens automatically. And then also the logs were accessed through both the St. Martin's University Information Technology staff and eThink support, which is something that already comes out of the St. Martin's budget already. So there was nothing that needed to be added there. And then all of the software I used was free as well. And so, but just as a potential budget, I did use the RStudio and GitHub were kind of the main two softwares I used that made this project possible. And if I were not an individual and had to pay for an enterprise version of those softwares, RStudio would have been $995 a year. And the base version of GitHub would have been $21 a year. So it's still not an expensive project, but just that it had the potential to cost something if I wasn't more of an individual doing this project. And then so for the next steps of this project, the next step for me is to present the findings of the project to my project client and her team. And so that means I'll be presenting the findings to decide on which plugins to permanently implement based on what I found in the logs for the spring classes, and also present to her the findings from kind of the general class analysis and what she can use to kind of improve instructional design to best meet the needs of the students and seamlessly kind of integrate content that will work with how students are already using Moodle. And then the next step after that will just be to continue kind of improving the reusability of the code. And a lot of the code I've written is already turned into like a function format. So that way, if another class uses a CSV file from the Moodle logs that downloads it manually, that they can just enter it into the function I've written and it'll pump out the same visualizations and analysis that I did for these next classes. And every type of visualization I did as well will be functionized. And then also just to improve the documentation on those functions I've written and the rest of the code that I use for the analysis. And this is just because even though for now all this work will be ending once I finish it, there was a lot of areas that I just didn't have time to get into. I felt like in terms of analyzing how students use Moodle, I just was kind of scratching the surface of what there is to know. And there's a lot of areas I would have loved to look in deeper if I had more time to look at them. And so I hope in the future, and maybe another student will take up a senior project to look at Moodle logs again And hopefully that I can use some of my project as a starting point of what they can do, because there's just a lot more to look at here if another student is willing to do it maybe next year. And then so I do have a bit of additional information for you. This first link is an R Markdown file of all of the code that I use to clean, analyze, and visualize the Moodle log, so you can take a look at that. And then the next link I have is a GitHub Pages link to more of a presentation view of the analysis. And this is just all of the analysis with none of the code, while the Markdown file has all of the code attached. So Markdown for the code, and then at GitHub Pages, that's just a presentation view. And then I also have a sample of the log files I captured that were captured by Moodle, so you can kind of get an idea of what kind of logs I was working with. And that is the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.